Hi, this is Dr. Claire, and this is our lecture on the digestive system. So all animals are heterotrophs, which means that they have to consume other organisms in order to get their organic molecules, in order to build proteins and get energy. So they have to eat something else in order to survive, all right? And so there are no photosynthetic animals out there. They don't exist. So they have to eat something. So there's a few different choices about what animals can eat. Many animals are herbivores. That means that they eat phototrophs, they eat producers, they eat plants or algae. Oftentimes when you are a herbivore, you don't eat the whole plant, you just eat part of the plant. You eat the leaves, or you eat the fruits, or you eat the seeds, things like that. And many different herbivores will actually have specific species of plants that they like to feed on, but others are more generalists and can eat many different types of plants. Plants are actually a really hard food source to get energy from, because a lot of the food in plants is actually made up of cellulose, and cellulose is very difficult to break down to get energy from. So a lot of times herbivores have very long, complex digestive systems that allow them to get those nutrients out of the plants. On the other end of the spectrum are the carnivores. Now, carnivores only eat other animals. So generally, carnivores are not eating phototrophs, they are eating other heterotrophs. Most of the time, that means that they're going to have very specialized weapons for capturing their prey, things like sharp teeth, big claws, things like that. And they tend to have much simpler digestive systems because meat is a much easier food to digest than plant material is. Of course, there are also omnivores, and omnivores eat a variety of different foods, both plants and animals. And some animals may change their diet depending on their life stage. So, for example, many birds are carnivores when they're young. They eat insects when they're growing. Their parents feed them insects, but then they may transition to things like seeds, which are an herbivorous food source when they're adult. We ourselves are a great example of an omnivore. We have an intermediate digestive system that allows us to use and consume both plant material and animal material. So if we're talking about digestive systems, all animals, except for sponges, remember sponges are weird, all animals have a digestive system of some variety that allows us to digest our food outside of our cells in some sort of special cavity. Okay, so some sort of pocket within our bodies. So it's inside the body, but outside the cells where we digest the food. Sponges are weird because sponges have specialized cells that will actually engulf little particles of food, and then they'll digest the food inside the cell rather than outside the cell. Some digestive systems are very simple. So some animals have what's called a gastrovascular cavity. Gastro for digestion and vascular because that's actually where they have gas exchange as well. So things like cnidarians, things like sea anemones and hydra and jellyfish, they're basically a sac. They have one opening. That opening serves as the mouth and the anus. So they take food in there and they expel waste out the same thing. And they also breathe the cavity allows them to breathe through it and digest through it, and it does all those one things, and has no specialized regions or any real complex patterns. But most other animals have what's called a digestive tract, which means that you're basically a tube. You've got a mouth that the food goes in, you've got another end the waste goes out. So you've got a mouth and an anus, and the food goes in one particular direction. And having that tube allows for different regions of the digestive system to be specialized for different functions. So when the food first comes in, different things need to happen than when the food is getting ready to go out, right? All right, so here's some examples of some different digestive systems. Some of them are very simple, like this is an earthworm system here. It still does have differentiation. These areas up here at the front are dealing with processing, whereas absorption is happening in these hind areas. But vertebrates in particular, like a dog or a human, have very complex digestive system with multiple different, very specialized regions. Okay? Oops. All right, so the food enters the digestive system through the mouth, and a lot of times the first thing that needs to happen is there needs to be some sort of food processing. So that oftentimes takes the form of chewing. In mammals, we have specialized teeth that are adapted to whatever our particular diet is. So when you look at a mammal and you look at their teeth, you can tell whether they're a carnivore, an herbivore, or an omnivore just by looking at the teeth. So carnivorous teeth tend to be very pointed. The teeth in the back are like serrated knives, so you can cut bits of flesh, but they don't really grind up the food very much. But if you're a carnivore, that's fine, because you can just swallow hunks of meat, and those are easy to digest chemically in the rest of your digestive system. They don't have to be broken down mechanically within the mouth. Herbivores, on the other hand, plant food being much more difficult to digest, you have to grind it up and break it down mechanically before you can digest it chemically. So if you look at the teeth of, say, a horse or a cow, they have these very broad, flat, rough edges, rough surfaces that they grind against each other to grind up that food into smaller pieces that are easier to digest chemically. And then you look like an omnivore like ourselves. We have some teeth that are well adapted for meat and other teeth that are well adapted for plants. So if you look at our teeth in the front, these are teeth that are good for cutting and shearing. So we can cut through a piece of meat, a turkey leg, you can take a big old hunk out of that and swallow it down. In the back, we have grinding teeth that are good for chewing up, say, a carrot. You can grind that up into a smaller chunks and swallow that down. All right, so you can tell a lot about an animal's diet by looking at its teeth. Birds don't have teeth. So what do? Birds actually have two different stomachs, one of which is called the gizzard. And the gizzard is a muscular structure with a really rough inner coating. And when a bird swallows its food, instead of grinding it up in its mouth like we do, it swallows it whole, and then that gizzard will contract and grind up the food. And a lot of birds, like ducks, for example, will actually eat rocks. They'll swallow rocks. Those will go down to the gizzard, and then when the gizzard is contracting, the rocks will actually help to grind up their food. So because they don't have teeth, they have to come up with another way to mechanically break down the food. All right, so inside the mouth, what's happening in there is you're grinding up the food, you're mixing it with your tongue with some saliva. The saliva has two functions. It moistens the food so that it's easier to swallow, and it also starts to chemically digest the food. So if you've ever tried to eat 10 saltines in a minute, you may know that's really, really hard. Saltines are very dry, and it's really difficult to produce enough saliva in 1 minute to adequately lubricate that food so that you can swallow it. So if you've ever done the 10 saltines in a minute challenge, it's really hard. Also, next time you're eating bread, if you have a piece of bread, put it in your mouth and chew it for like 2 minutes. What you should notice is that over time that bread is going to start to taste sweet. And the reason that is because the breakdown that's starting to happen in the mouth is that you have an enzyme called salivary amylase. And amylase breaks starches down into simple sugars. So as you're chewing that bread over a long period of time, that salivary amylase is going to start to break down those starches in the bread into simple sugars, which will taste sweet to your tongue. Okay? Salivation, which is really important, is actually controlled by the nervous system. And if you think about a food that you'd really like to eat, if you're hungry and you think about your favorite food, you should notice that your mouth starts to water. Even the thought of food can actually produce a salivatory response. Or if you walk into your house and someone has been cooking something delicious, then you get the same response. I'm kind of salivating just thinking about food right now. All right. So you've ground up the food, you've mixed it with saliva, you need to swallow it. All right, so swallowing starts as a voluntary action. Once you have decided that your food is adequately mixed up, you move it to the back of your mouth with your tongue, and you consciously make a decision to swallow it. Once you've made that conscious decision, the rest of the process is actually involuntary. So it moves it to the back of the mouth, and then you have this contraction that pushes it down. This is what it looks like. It pushes it down the esophagus. So your esophagus, it's made up of smooth muscle. Remember, smooth muscle is under involuntary control, and it'll have a wave-like contraction that'll push that bunch of food all the way down your throat and into your stomach. And then at the bottom of the esophagus, there's a sphincter that will open to allow the food to pass through, and then close again so that you don't get stomach acid moving up into your esophagus. One of the causes of heartburn is actually stomach acid in your esophagus, and it can be quite damaging to the esophagus. All right, so now the food's in your stomach. What's happening in the stomach? Well, there's a number of things going on in there. Your stomach is producing a bunch of mucus, again, lubricating things. Your stomach also produces an enzyme called pepsin, which breaks down proteins. And your stomach produces a heck of a lot of acid. Now, why is your stomach producing acid? That doesn't seem like a great thing. Well, the pepsin actually works better in an acid environment, so it breaks down the proteins more effectively. And that acid environment can kill any potential pathogens that might be in your food that might make you sick. So it helps to prevent any bacteria or parasites that might be in the food you're eating from infecting you. So that acid is very protective. Your stomach is also very muscular, so it's going to contract and kind of mush everything around and stir it together. But there's really not a whole heck of a lot of digestion going on in your stomach. Yeah, the pepsin is breaking down some of the proteins, but the carbohydrates and the fats in your food are really not getting broken down in the stomach very much, and you're not absorbing very much. You can absorb water through your stomach lining. You can also absorb certain drugs like aspirin and also alcohol through your stomach lining, which is why you have to be careful because alcohol can get into your system relatively quickly. It doesn't have to wait to your intestine to be absorbed. All right, so then the food passes out of the stomach and it goes into the small intestine. In the small intestine, there are 3 different segments. There's the duodenum or the duodenum, depending on whether you are a Brit or an American. The Brits, for some reason, say duodenum, and so do I, even though I'm not a Brit. And then Americans tend to say duodenum. So whatever you like, they're both correct. In that area, in the duodenum, is largely where most of the digestion is going on. So that's where most of your food is getting broken down into its component parts. And so that's where the bulk of the digestion is happening. Then it passes into jejunum. In the jejunum, you have the absorption of the nutrients out of the food. It then passes into the ileum, and in the ileum, you have the absorption of vitamins and minerals. So the bulk of the absorption and the digestion is happening in your small intestine. Your small intestine is really, really important. Because it is really important, particularly for the absorption, it has a really large surface area. Remember, surface areas, we're going to be coming back to this a lot. Surface areas, if you have a greater surface over which interactions can take place, it's going to be a lot more efficient. So if you look at the lining of the small intestine, there are lots of these little extensions. It's folded. There are lots of these little folds of the lining. And then coming off of the folds are villi, which are these little tiny like finger-like extensions. And if you look at each of the villi independently, they're covered in microvilli. So this makes a huge, huge, huge surface area, which makes it way easier for you to absorb those nutrients into your body. Incidentally, for people who have celiac disease, people with celiacs can't eat gluten. One of the reasons why they cannot eat gluten is because the gluten protein gets into the microvilli and gums them up and causes an immune reaction which damages the microvilli. And so because the microvilli are really damaged, you don't have as much surface area. The person with celiac disease has stomach pain and discomfort and isn't absorbing nutrients well, and they often get anemia and other conditions that are caused by poor absorption of nutrients from the food. So that surface area is really, really important. Attached to the small intestine are some very important accessory organs that assist with digestion. There's the liver. The liver has a couple of different functions. It also is the poison control center in addition to being part of the digestive system, so it helps to break down toxins in the body. But it also produces bile. And bile is a combination of salts that help to emulsify fats in your diet. So if you think about if you make salad dressing, you've got the vinegar, you've got the oil, and they stay really separate from each other. If you imagine a big ball of oil floating through your intestine, like you ate fried chicken or something, and you've got these globs of oil, those are going to be really difficult to digest as big globs. You need to get them to break apart. And that's what the bile does. It's kind of like dish soap. When you add dish soap to an oily pan, it allows the oil to be dissolved into the water. It emulsifies the oil. That's what bile does. And so the liver produces the bile. It gets stored in your gallbladder. And then when you eat something really fatty, your gallbladder gets triggered to contract, and it'll push that bile out, and it'll go through a duct and into your small intestine to help you break down that fat and deal with it. All right. This is why if somebody has gallstones, it can be very painful a lot of times when they eat, but particularly if they eat fatty foods, because when you have gallstones, your gallbladder goes to contract. There's a little tiny crystal or something that's blocking the duct, and then it's an extremely painful condition because it's under pressure. Okay, so that's what's going on with that. You can survive without your gallbladder. Your liver does continue to produce bile. It just goes directly into your small intestine, and it can't be stored. So if you lose your gallbladder, you just have to be careful about eating really fatty meals, because you have a little bit of a hard time if you eat a lot of fat at once, because you don't have the gallbladder to store the bile. The pancreas is also incredibly important, because the pancreas is producing the digestive enzymes that break down carbohydrates, that break down fats into their constituent fatty acids, that break down proteins into individual amino acids, and allow you to absorb all your food. So all of those really important digestive enzymes are being produced by the pancreas and secreted into the small intestine through a duct. The pancreas also produces bicarbonate, which is a weak base that neutralizes the stomach acid. So without your pancreas, your stomach acid would go into your small intestine and chew up your small intestine, and you'd feel really lousy. But the bicarbonate produced by the pancreas neutralizes the stomach acid, so it doesn't damage the rest of your digestive system. Very important organ. All right, so we got these enzymes, we're in the small intestine, we're breaking down the proteins into amino acids and absorbing them through the cell walls, or cell membranes rather, the cell membranes in the wall of your intestine. We're breaking down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars and absorbing them in there. We're emulsifying the fat droplets and then breaking them down into fatty acids, and those can just pass right through the membrane, because the membrane is also a fatty acid. Getting all these things out of your food and into your system so that you can use them. All right, finally the food goes into the large intestine. Large intestine is wider and shorter than the small intestine. And what's happening in the large intestine is largely reabsorption of water and electrolytes that you would otherwise poop out, basically. And also in the large intestine, there are beneficial bacteria that will digest any unused things that you've eaten. So, for example, if you eat a lot of cellulose, we can't digest cellulose. We don't have an enzyme to do that, but the bacteria in our guts do. They love that stuff. They'll break it down, and when they break it down, they'll use it to grow, and when they grow, they'll produce some gases, some carbon dioxide, and then you fart. So that's just what happens. You've got bugs that live in your gut, and they like the food that you eat too. So you're going to produce some gases, but then, and actually those beneficial bacteria become really important when you start looking at animals that only eat plant matter, because no animal has the ability to digest cellulose. They have to rely on these bacteria to help them to digest the cellulose. All right, so the food's passing through your large intestine. It's getting compacted, and it's passed to the rectum, and it finally passes out the anus. The anus has two sphincter muscles, one that's under your conscious control and one that's under your unconscious control. So when you start to feel the need to poop, that would be the unconscious sphincter opening. And then you get to the bathroom and you decide to poop, and that's your conscious sphincter opening. You're making a decision, I'm going to poop now. But the feeling that you need to poop is actually caused by your involuntary sphincter opening. Okay. Yes. All right, so let's just take a look at some of these. That's the human digestive system generally. Let's compare that to some other animal digestive systems. So the symbiotic microbes that live in our gut, they do beneficial things for us, like they make vitamin K, among other things. But in other animals that are herbivores, they're really important, because they actually allow them to get nutrients or break down cellulose into energy that they can use. So some herbivores are what are called ruminants, where they have a multi-chambered stomach that has these beneficial bacteria living in it, and they actually will digest the cellulose in the stomach, and they will also ruminate, which basically means that they'll digest it with the bacteria for a little while, they'll regurgitate it, they'll chew it again, they'll swallow it back down. So if you've ever watched a cow, the cow might be sitting in the field, and suddenly the cow goes and chews for a while. It's just regurgitated some grass, it chews it again, it swallows back down until the bacteria in its stomach break that grass down enough that it can pass out of the stomach and into the small intestine. And then in the small intestine, they break down not only the grass that it has a chance to that the bacteria have had a chance to break down the cellulose in, but also they digest the bacteria. So the bacteria are growing and reproducing in the stomach, and then they get digested as they pass into the intestine, which is kind of cool. Not all herbivores have bacteria in their stomach. Others have what's called a cecum, a large area in their large intestine, which will help them to digest cellulose. There's usually a big population of bacteria living in that cecum area, and helps them to digest their food as well, but it's a little bit different. If you compare the herbivore guts to carnivore guts, so here's some carnivore guts, you can see they are much shorter, much less complex, and that's because animal material is way easier to digest than plant material. All right, that's our lecture on the digestive system. Catch you guys next time.